All right. So we're very excited about tonight's presentation. Again, I'm Chris Jacobs. I'm the Executive Director of Pinewoods Camp, and some of you may have never heard of Pinewoods. It's a music, song, and dance camp that focuses on folk and traditional music. And we are located in Plymouth, Mass, nestled between Long Pond and Round Pond. We are getting ready to celebrate our centennial here very shortly. So we're very excited to also be partnering with Wild Ones South Shore Mass chapter, which I'm a member of and on the board there. And I'm going to introduce the president in just a moment. But before that, I'm very excited to say that this is being sponsored in part by Mass Cultural Council and the Scituate and Plymouth local cultural councils. So they're helping fund this project, and we're very excited. And it will be posted to YouTube, our Pinewoods Camp YouTube video. Usually it takes us a couple of weeks to get that up, but yeah, well, so you'll be able to go back, and if you love it and want to share it with your friends, you'll be able to do that as well. So right now I'm going to turn it over to David, and he'll just, David Baker, he is the president of Wild Ones South Shore Mass chapter.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I'm the president of the South Shore Mass Wild Ones. We're a chapter of a national organization. Wild Ones is a national group with chapters all over the country. We are focused on getting native plants into the landscape. So if you're into native plants, check us out. I would like to welcome our chapter members. I've seen a few of your names come by, so welcome Wild Ones chapter members to our presentation tonight, and welcome to all our new friends. I'll put our website in the chat there to check out later. Don't check it out now, because you got to focus on Elizabeth.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, David. And now tonight, throughout the presentation, David is going to be monitoring the chat. And so if you have questions for Elizabeth, specifically on the topic that she is talking about, feel free to post a note in the chat, and David will ask Elizabeth. And then we'll also open up everything at the end for a Q&A. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Elizabeth James Perry, a culture bearer. She's a Mass Cultural Council Award recipient and a tribal citizen of the Wampanoag tribe of Head-Aquinnah. And so we're going to take it away, Elizabeth, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me. Ciao, Wanikisak, everybody. My name is Elizabeth James Perry, as you heard, and I am a tribal artist as well as being an avid plant fan. I've been working with plants for more than a decade. A lot of plants underlie what I am able to do with my arts. And so knowing where I can gather dyes, fiber plants in the wild, or how to cultivate them here on my property if they've become rare, which many things have in the New England region over the past several hundred years. Those are all things that I do. You can check out my website, which is elizabethjamesperry.com, if you'd like to see my wampum and my textiles. And I also do other things like map making and pottery and regalia design as well in my community. So I thought I'd start with some really delicious food plants that are, used to be ubiquitous. I think they've become a bit more rare. In New England, these are two photos of beech plums. I usually go back to my community to harvest beech plums on Martha's Vineyard. They're largely coastal, but they also occur often in inland sandy areas, pine barrens. They like that type of soil, but they'll grow on other less sandy soils. I'm just not sure if they produce quite as prolifically if the habitat isn't ideal. These are right on, almost on the water's edge in my community. And my trick to getting as many beech plums as I'd like is usually I'll just go and pick on the bushes that have poison ivy on them because no one else will touch them. So there's a lot of fruit. So I pick like crazy, and then I run to the ocean. I rinse my arms off in the salt water so I don't get the rash. But anyway, that's how I've been able to get a pretty good harvest. These are a really nice fruit to enjoy because they occur almost at the end of the season. So end of August, early September is the time to kind of look for them. Obviously, it makes sense if you want to plan and ID the bushes in advance of the harvest season, then you can be ready when they're ready to go and do your harvesting. I always encourage folks when they are harvesting wild foods to be very selective, only get a small portion because there's going to be other people harvesting, but there's also going to be plenty of wildlife. I've seen fox scat on the island with what appear to be beech plum seeds in them. And so there's all kinds of birds that use them, all kinds of other animals that would have used them as well, that might not be so common on the island, but certainly still occur on the mainland. Along with beech plums, there's a lot of other fruits. At the end of the season in October, there's the cranberry. The wild cranberries occur in wild cranberry bogs. They're kind of semi-wet. Sometimes they're very wet depending on the year. Also, many of them are rather close to the coast, so they're a little bit vulnerable to things like sea level rise and erosion that you see happening with the various storms and hurricanes that happen in the Northeast. Cranberries are a wonderful food. They're really high in vitamin C. And so they're something that you really look forward to and something that you can also dry and kind of extend the season and keep eating them or keep adding them into, we'll add them into cornbreads, boiled cornbreads. We'll add them into stews to add a certain richness as well. But they're also perfectly good as homemade cranberry sauce or, just for fun, just eat them fresh. The photo in the upper left is actually what I like to call a blueberry tree. It's technically a blueberry bush, but it's very, very old. And I was in a past job, I used to monitor a lot of archaeological sites throughout New England, mainly Massachusetts and Eastern Rhode Island. And I was on Martha's Vineyard and near a site that was going to be developed, for a house and whatnot. There were these trees, and on close examination, I realized they're actually blueberry bushes. So they're from old tribal homesteads where folks were growing blueberries for, to supplement their diet, same as always, and for medicinal purposes, like, blueberry leaf tea is good for diabetes. So if you want to balance your sugar, that's always good to have. And these just kept growing and growing. So this one's at least a couple of 100 years old. It was cored by somebody, or one of them, there were several, was cored to identify the age. And I thought it was quite remarkable. So there's someone standing there. You can see the back of another tribal member's head to give you a sense of the height. It's quite remarkable to me. And I've heard other stories from other states of unusually old vines and unusually old bushes. And it just, it's a neat feeling to think about picking in the same place that literally your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents were picking as well. It's just a nice thought, nice to think of the wildlife enjoying it too. Of course, in New England, there's wild strawberries, and they're a sort of a fine, delicate version of our domestic strawberries that are so huge, kind of oversized nowadays. They have a really wonderful, delicate flavor. These are all very good for you, really high in antioxidants. They're good for your eyesight. They've got vitamin C. They're just wonderful things to have throughout the growing season. And again, like the blueberry and the cranberry, and you can dry beech plums. They're not as tasty in my opinion. You can also dry strawberries and use them beyond the growing season for strawberries in New England. So those are some of the fruits. There's also other fruits. I guess I'd add, wintergreen or tea berry is delicious. It's delicate. It likes to grow in pine barrens. Partridge berry is another tasty little berry. And when you pick, just don't pick everything, definitely leave some wildlife, birds, bears, the whole nine. They depend on those really good fruits as well. Often in wild cranberry bogs in the mainland, I'll see a moose track, sometimes bear tracks as well. So we're sharing those places with a lot of other beings, and it's really good to be respectful of that and to share. Sumac berries are delicious too, and they make a good lemonade. And sumac berries have a multiple use in that I also harvest them not just to eat, but also to use as a really nice red dye. They're really common. They seem to be pretty rugged and tolerant even of the drought conditions we've been having. And so that's another nice one in the Northeast to look for. So I'll transition from some of the fruits to talk about some of the edible tubers. I like groundnuts a lot. They're not as common as they used to be. I think to some degree, soil quality has changed. I think that, there might be other things it's kind of harder to get at, not knowing what, insects or over competition from invasive species might have reduced their population. So I keep my eye peeled, and I've identified them in a few different places, but not as nearly as common as I'd like them to be. They do like sandy soil, and they do really well in sandy soils, but they'll grow in soils that are a little bit more clay as well. They just won't get as big. So they're a delicious root. If you harvest the root, wash them good, and boil them up, they're very good in like a turkey soup. It's just really delicious. And I tend to harvest them right at the end of the season in November, December, January, when the plants have died back and the nutrients are mainly in the roots. Jerusalem artichoke is another wonderful root plant, edible tuber. They're pretty robust. They will spread rather quickly. And so they can be considered a little bit invasive. So when you plant them, you might want to keep an eye on them. Don't put them next to something that you don't want quickly enveloped or do a lot of plants do a lot of tending and harvesting. And again, boiling them up is great. You can boil them and then bake them. There's a number of different wonderful recipes. There's a lot of really good native recipes out there. A lot of them have been adapted to use, the potatoes that we've gotten from South America, Central America as well. But these are locals, and I would kind of suggest, if you want them, sunchokes you can buy. Groundnuts, it's worth your while to plant some. When you do harvest them, be really selective. Don't take everything. And the strings, the tubers are on a string. So if you kind of cut the rootlet between and replant that, it will grow more plants. So you won't sort of decimate your patch if you're growing them in your backyard. So that's one way to remember it. And you can see these, it's sort of a vine plant. And so you can kind of see this 5-leaf plant in the upper left. And that's a groundnut. There are a couple of different species. One is sort of a little more, to me, it's a delicious potato taste, but it's a little bit less earthy in some ways. And then the other one has a bit more of a peanut taste, but they're both delicious in soups and very good for you. They're higher protein than a conventional potato. They're not in the nightshade family, they're different. So these are some flowers that are, I didn't put as many flowers in this slide as I intended to, but there are a lot of other flowering plant species in New England that are pretty useful for dyes. Goldenrod, of course, is wonderful for dyes, but it's also really great for native bee species and for honeybees, which are introduced, but still really important, and bumblebees. And they'll bloom late season. And so it's really nice when you can have things throughout your property that bloom different times of year. You can really support those pollinators, so they're not scrambling for something late season or plumb out of luck. The violets, of course, are the opposite. They're very early, and they're delicious. You can eat the flowers, you can eat the young leaves. They're beautiful. This one is pictured in a little cedar bark basket that I made for the purposes of education. So these are really delicious, and they also make a nice tea. You can make a nice syrup out of violet as well. So in addition to growing a lot of indigenous native plant species, I also grow native cultivins. And so the things that we used in horticulture traditionally throughout a lot of the country is corn, beans, and squash. Also indigenous watermelons, sunflowers, of course, are wonderful for the seeds, and they're very nutritious to eat. And you can add them into cornbreads or other types of breads as well. And so I worked on a garden project at MFA called Raven Reshapes Boston, and it was a collaborative project. I produced a corn, beans, and squash garden edged with sedges in the shape of a horseshoe crab. And then my partner artist, Equa Holmes, she planted hundreds of beautiful sunflowers, several different species, And it was really a nice combination to have the two gardens. And I remember, it's always interesting to me to see gardens in a city context, because I am not a city person. And I'm always curious what's going to happen. Is there going to be anything around to graze? Are they going to have a hard time growing with the pollution? And I remember checking out the green beans, and they were growing really well. And when I came back, I felt like they were growing really well, but they somehow looked like they had shrunk and refilled out. And when I got down and checked the stems, obviously, something got in. I think rabbits were hopping in before the traffic started and everything in the morning. And so I was actually glad to see some wildlife benefiting from the presence of the garden there. The public seemed to really enjoy it as well. And then the corn was growing. We didn't put squashes actually in this one because I was kind of worried a little bit about mildew, sometimes with overwatering and things like that. That can be an issue with squashes, depending on the year. So that's why it was kind of limited. And this one I edged in quahog shell. It's actually like 1.5 tons of my quahog shells that I use for my wampum. So that was a good workout. Definitely. I did not need a gym membership after I moved all those. There's some wild plants here that are really beautiful, I think, just visually appealing. On this wonderful variety of shades of green when you go out into the woods and into the bogs and fields in Massachusetts. And then there's also some signs of wildlife, which I thought I'd share. So on the left is a tree that was felled by a beaver in Western Massachusetts, well, central Western Connecticut River area. And so you can see the tooth marks at the base where it brought it down, and then it continued to work the bark off because it was using the bark. And beavers are really beneficial to wild places in that they'll restructure the waterways, create new wetlands, open up areas that might be kind of choked with a lot of vegetation. We don't have, a big native population anymore doing controlled burns in certain areas to kind of balance things out a little bit and open new places for deer and all. So when beavers do that, they produce new plants, new trees, a lot of alder, red osier dogwood grows along these waterways. And so the beaver have their ideal foods that they can store for the next season. And then also a lot of browsing animals like deer and moose and things like that can be happy because they're going to suddenly get a bunch of greens that are within reach, so it's not just mature forest, but there's new growth for them. So it's a nice cycle of productivity, and it's good for the health of the water itself. There's a moose wood here, which I thought was a nice find. So you can see where a moose had scraped. Male mooses like to scrape and mark trees, certain types of trees, and they eat they'll eat the outer bark as well on these trees. And so they have rather a distinctive look because they look like they've been peeled as well. If you could see some of the younger branches. There's along the bottom, some tea plants, and I included white pine as well. You can make a tea, but you can also just eat the buds of white pine because they're very high in vitamin C. And then there's some sweet fern, moving right to left, there's sweet fern. Sweet fern is something that's great for an herbal tea. It's very healthful for you. It's also got astringent properties, so it's a good skin rinse if you have some kind of skin irritation or a rash or something like that. Has a really distinctive scent. And the rinse is also something that keeps insects away too. So the skin treatment, Skin So Soft, actually has sweet fern in it. That's what gives it its distinctive scent. And that is actually pretty effective in keeping bugs off of you in the summertime if you're worried about mosquitoes and stuff. It's really helpful, and it's all natural. It's not toxic at all. Moose like to browse on it, and deer as well. And so it's nice to have around, and it's pretty hardy. You can trim it and it'll keep growing, and it will grow in disturbed areas. So it's pretty robust. It's called sweet fern, but it's not a true fern, it's a bush.
What's the plant on the top right?
Top right, spikenard. So if you look at it's young, and it's low, but it will kind of, each year it grows up, from nothing to bushy. Like bushy, I should say, like up 2 feet high, maybe, and they have pretty copious berries, and the birds, wild birds, just descend. Really pretty much leave it for the birds. But I grow it because it is one of the several plants that we use to make traditional root beer in our tribal communities. Probably the last person in my community who commonly did that was Gladys Wittes. So some of the older generation folks, Gladys passed away in like 2012. She was almost 100. Her generation folks did a lot of farming, and they lived off the land more so than the next couple of generations that were traveling to go to college or going to, embark and join the army and participate in World War II and things like that. And so traveled quite a bit. Some folks came home, some folks, settled on the mainland and that sort of thing, because there's year-round work. So some of that takes you away from areas that might still be green and rich in plant resources. But we continue to go back to wilder areas surrounding the cities to make traditional drinks, and continue to go back to the island, as I mentioned before, to harvest the cranberry. That's something everybody looks forward to. And Gladys and some other folks went out of the way to make it a traditional, to get our traditional harvesting recognized as a holiday. So we have Cranberry Day, and so we can pull the kids out of school without the kids getting in trouble and that sort of thing. So it was good thinking on their part to make that possible. And then at the bottom on the left is a picture of Labrador tea. That isn't as common in the Northeast as it used to be, but it's a beautiful bog bush. It likes moisture. Seems to like rocky soils too, from what I can see from where I've observed it. It has a very textured leaf, which is quite interesting. It makes a really unique, very interesting tea. It's very good for you. And again, it's one of those that you'd want to grow rather than wild harvest, because as I said, I look for them all the time and I rarely see them. So that, tells me that they're just not as common as they used to be. There's a lot of habitat disturbance that's happened. And the climate is changing as well, so perhaps that influences distribution. And then the little plant in the pots, in the potting tray here, that is Oswego tea, or more commonly known as bee balm. That's a wild bee balm, so that one's not red. It's the pretty sort of delicate lavender flower. And pollinators love it. I like to grow it because it has that wonderful scent. It makes a nice tea. That's good for you. And also my hummingbird moths really love it. And so, if I'm careful to keep my bee balm patch growing well, I'll usually get a couple of hummingbird moths that will come and visit. And so that's really nice. It's something nice to share with the next generation. I think it fascinates kids to see the range of pollinators we have in the Northeast. Here are some cordage plants. And so, as I mentioned, I do quite a bit of spinning, dyeing, and weaving, some with fine fibers, some with coarser tree barks as well. So I have a picture of some milkweed on the right with a little ladybug on it. And you can see the flowers that haven't opened yet. There's also a photo of butterfly weed. So those grow in a range of habitats. Common milkweed, there's a ton of different milkweeds. Butterfly weed is related. Butterfly weed does really like a sandy soil. They seem to do really well in the semi-sandy situation. Not as common as they used to be, because they also are benefited by routine burns. And those, as I said, aren't happening so much anymore. And so, sometimes the distribution of a plant becomes a little bit less frequent. I think the other thing with milkweeds is they're not as common as they used to be, because folks who harvest their grasses for, hay, basically harvest hay for, cows and horses and stuff, tend to pull out all of their milkweed and butterfly weed because they're toxic to domestic animals. And so I think one of the reasons why I don't see butterfly weed growing just anywhere anymore, even on the island where there used to be some good sized patches, is that folks have picked it to make sure it's not growing, unfortunately. I harvest the plants in the wintertime when they're done growing, the butterflies have used them, everything's gone, it's all dried out, the leaves are gone, and I just peel it. I peel the inner bark off basically of the plant, and that's what I do use for spinning and doing some weaving or braiding. Basswood is a tree whose inner bark. So, if you're using tree bark, you don't want to cut down a tree because that's a horrible waste. Unless you're doing a tribal project where you have a use for each different section of the tree, which we're sometimes able to do. So most of the time when you're harvesting a bark, you just want to take a branch. You want to take just what you need and leave the trees in good health. So spruce root can be harvested without killing the tree. You just selectively take some. Basswood bark, it's the inner bark. So that's wonderfully strong, long fiber. And so you can create ropes, twines, nets, mats, the whole nine. Some of those arts are not so common nowadays, as you might guess, because it's a different life we live now. And few people have the luxury to be able to do things like work with traditional plants, as their 9-to-5 job. And so it's something that you squeeze in at the end of the day or weekends or once in a while when you have time or when a community is holding a special event or something like that. But it's always enjoyable either way. These are some examples of what you can do with some of those plants. So there's a sweetgrass basket that I wove. It's a little acorn shaped basket, and cedar bark basket. There's a couple of baskets that are older that my great grandmother made. She was born in the late 1860s in Head-Aquinnah. And we would have powwows and tourists would come. And so family members would make tiny baskets for tourists, sometimes larger baskets as well. And folks are still using baskets in their daily life. So they were using the same type of material for the miniatures. So the basswood is one of the fibers. And then the other one is made with ash and sweetgrass. And then my picture here in the center on the black background is a corn husk bag that I wove using sweetgrass as the warp. I bundled sweetgrass and then I tightly twined it with corn husk. This is all natural except the very top, which has been dyed with black walnut. And when we're dyeing with nuts, you're not using the meat that you eat because that would be a terrible waste. You want to use the husk of the nut that just peels off in the season of harvest in the fall. And then here's some corn from my MFA garden with a tribal member and someone from the MFA looking on as well. And so we were growing callus corn, which was actually has an interesting story. So that particular brand of heirloom corn was found by a friend of mine who is a grandmother, so it wasn't recent. In her youth, they had a couple of older brothers in town in northern Vermont, and they had this very, very old house that was crumbling basically. And so some of the younger townsfolk offered to rebuild their house. And so when they moved in, took the house apart, emptied it out, Judy said she found in the walls these dried corn husks as insulation. How somehow old houses will have like slats of wood. I've seen that. A friend of mine has an 18th century house. And so you've got this funny insulation material that was used. This particular house had these corn cobs. Some of them still had seeds on these dried corn cobs. And there was also a jar or two of corn seed in the basement that had been stored there for a very long time. She became fascinated by it and grew it out, and then eventually gave it to Fedco Seeds. And so I liked her story. And she had shared seeds with me in the past. So when I did the MFA garden, I decided to use that particular variety because of the connection of knowing that story. So I think, part of enjoying plants is going out on the land and enjoying the seasons and the weather in New England. Part of it is kind of family-based, being able to go out with older generations or hear about their adventures or misadventures, as might be the case, on the land, gathering supplies and, making foods and teas and things like that. And then also just being able to use some of the material for arts is another important way to kind of stay connected to nature, I think, and honor the natural world. This is a slide that I filled with some dye images. So in the upper left are some corn husk. I think I put them in blueberry or blackberry to get kind of a nice lavender color. There's also some nice yellow dyed yarn. So sunflower petals are a great dye for yellows. But there are a bunch of different dyes for yellow. Sumac wood, you know, if you cut the shavings and soak them and then simmer them, you can get a nice yellow out of that as well. And then in the picture in the upper right, you see sunflower petals. There's some wood shavings, maybe from root shavings, maybe madder root. There's oak galls. Oak galls, as you guys probably know, I'm not sure if you're all from New England. I'm not sure what the distribution of oak galls are, but they're kind of this growth, very lightweight growth on oak leaves that are caused by insects. You know, they get in there, irritate, and kind of form this little growth, and then they burrow out. So then when you get the oak galls, it's not like there's bugs in them or something like that. At the end of the year when they dried, they fall off the tree, you pick them up, and usually I crush them up and simmer them, and they make a nice tan dye. And then in the lower left, you can see where I did a dye workshop at one of the colleges I was working with. And we dyed a bunch of organic socks, and we got a lot of nice colors, and everybody took the socks home, and we had a great time. And so you can kind of see a bunch of nice earth tones. I got a really nice pink. I don't always get a nice pink when I'm doing dyes. So that was a good pink day. That was a nice surprise. Usually I'll overshoot and get like a red or brick red or something like that. But this was really nice and subdued. And then there's a pan where you can see that I'm using some black walnut dye on porcupine quills, which again is another natural material. You know, wasn't necessarily common to eat porcupines, but you know, you can harvest just by throwing a blanket on an animal. You know, you can find a kill and harvest them that way from what's left. Nowadays, of course, car traffic, you know, one of the best ways to get quills is just to find roadkill. As long as it's not too fragrant, it kind of can ruin friendships if you harvest really old roadkill porcupines. But, you know, as long as you're careful about who you're traveling with when you harvest, you know, it works out pretty well. You just kind of pick out as many of the quills as you need, wash them really good. I just use a warm soapy water. Some people boil their quills a little bit just to get, you know, any detritus or oils or anything off of them. But I usually boil mine in the act of dyeing them, so I don't want to overstress them with the extra boiling. Another material that Native folks use for a variety of things was maple. The sugar maple, of course, has a sap that is edible and delicious, and Native people made syrup. It was called Indian sugar because it was not something that was, you know, harvested in England. So it was new to the colonists who came here, just like groundnuts would be new, and some of the other plants that we use on a regular basis here. And so on the lower left were some really good looking candies that I made with some tribal kids in the after school program. We had a really nice long session where we took the syrup and we boiled it down, and we hit the right temperature points so that it gelled nicely. We had forms and we did seashell designs, and then they ate some, got super hyper, and then they packaged the rest up and took them to their parents. So they were pretty happy about that. It's a really nice seasonal activity, and it's very tasty, very sweet, but it has a nice flavor. And there's you know, unlike some highly processed sugars, maple syrup has a nutritional profile. It does provide some nutrients. And of course, the maple wasn't necessarily always boiled to thick syrup or, you know, boiled to candy. It was also used much lighter as a base for making tea. So it would just provide a little bit of sweet and a little bit of that maple flavor to your, you know, sassafras tea or blueberry tea, whatever it was that you were making. And that's I went through this quick. That's my thank you slide. But I'm happy to answer questions or go back and show you anything again. Talk about other plants or trees.
Yeah, we did have a couple questions that I wasn't able to stop you in time when you moved on to the next topic. So one of the questions was, how do you make the tea? You mentioned making tea out of various plants. What's your process for that?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the tea slide so we can look at materials too while I'm talking. Sure, so with Labrador tea and bee balm and sweet fern, you gather the leaves. I usually use things fresh, but you can also preserve them. So if you want several cups of tea or you're going to have it later or whatever, you can dry the leaves really carefully. I'll usually lay them out on, a cookie sheet, let them dry really well in a, on top of my fridge or something, and then use them for a tea. Teas, I just use a tea ball and pour boiling water. If you are making a tea and you want it to be stronger, then you make an infusion. So you put the herb in the water and simmer it, for 5 or 10 minutes or however long you want to make a stronger tea. So you're going to have more flavor. It might be a slightly different flavor. And, I think that some things do well with that. Some things, you don't necessarily want to overcook them. So you kind of figure out what you like the flavor of. Root teas like wild sarsaparilla. I gather the root, wash it really well, and then I basically either simmer it fresh, or you can dry the roots really well. When you dry roots, you want to be really thorough. You don't want to half dry a root and then chuck it in a bag and put it away because it could develop fungus and really not be good for you and not taste good at all, but definitely not be edible. So you want to make sure if you have to hang your roots or hang a plant up to dry it, then you can do that as well. You just want to make sure that you're maybe availing yourself of warmer air in your house, or warm air outside if you want to dry it outside, but in the shade a little bit. So it's just not, dried super fast and maybe stripped of healthful qualities as well. So yeah, there's a range. And then, you can buy a lot of native teas on the market now too. And then there's teas that native people started to use because the plants were introduced, like hawthorn tea is not from here. But hawthorn berry tea became common tea in tribal communities. You can still find them around old tribal homesteads on the island. The houses are long gone, but you can see the cellars and the root cellars, and you can see the trees and the plants that folks were growing nearby. And then, cranberry leaf tea, blueberry leaf tea, you can buy those, but you can also harvest them wild. I would say when you're harvesting, try to find places that aren't polluted. Don't go next to a dump or, a highway that's really congested or something like that, because you don't need those toxins that could be in the plant. So try to be mindful of the area and its health before you go and wild harvest. Sometimes growing it in your property away from the road is a good idea, because then you can be assured that nobody dumped anything or whatever.
Thank you. We had another question about the quills that you were dyeing. What did you use those for?
Sure. So the porcupine quills are actually used for woven quill work. I didn't put the picture in here. I should have. I could actually probably, I don't know if my technical expertise is going to allow me to show you, but if you look at my website, elizabethjamesperry.com, you'll see woven quill bracelet cuffs in blue and white. There might be a multicolored one in there as well. And so I'll use madder root or sumac berries, Osage orange. Actually, it's called Osage orange, but it's a really nice yellow dye. We'll dye quills. And logwood is a really nice one. That's a trade material. It's not from around here, but it's an indigenous tree. Those will give you some really nice colors. And then I set it up on a loom and weave strips for either a belt, which is really time consuming, or a cuff. I also use them in applique work. So native regalia, so moccasins or a skirt or a mantle, might have some really nice decoration. You can think of quill work as kind of the traditional version of glass beadwork. So glass beads are a trade material. But before then, and along with that, we were using porcupine quills for the same colorful, fine decorative work. So if you can picture the floral patterns and vine patterns and geometrics in porcupine quills and more of a natural dye palette, and then kind of think of modern powwow regalia with brighter beadwork, and put some of the same geometrics and floral designs. Those are sort of related arts, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Elizabeth, another question came in. So the porcupine quills, are they porous enough to take the dye?
Oh, yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, it's a natural material. Yep.
Interesting. Cool.
And when you were talking about the sumac berries, did you mean the staghorn sumac or is it a different kind of sumac?
So we have a few here. I use staghorn sumac and smooth sumac. I don't use poisonous sumac. It's different looking. And poisonous sumac obviously is a serious skin irritant, so that's not something that I use. But the staghorn is super common. Smooth sumac is also super common. They have red berries. You see them all the time in the Northeast along highways and things. It grows everywhere. And so you can find a nice stand and pick a few and use them as a nice dye. But they're also tasty. If you like tart things, they're tasty. It depends on what your palate is, I guess.
And we have a couple more questions about teas. Do you ever make tea from the basswood flowers?
Yeah, I've had that actually. It's supposed to be really good for you. And that's another one too. If you don't have them growing, you can buy linden flowers is often how they're, I think linden would be the English name for the plant. So yeah, they're really nice. There's a bunch of flower, like elderberry. The flower actually makes a really nice tea as well. And elderberries, of course, are really good for eating. You can make an elderberry tea out of the berries too. It's pretty good. It's rich. So, I know there's a lady, I'm just scrolling through the pictures here. Susan, who had her hand up. I just want to make sure everyone gets their questions.
Okay.
Sorry. Emma, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, hi, I'm sorry. I couldn't figure out where the question
the
thing
chat
was.
was, okay.
You showed some pink fabric you had dyed, and I'm sorry if I missed, what was the plant that you used to get pink dye?
You know, that day, I don't know if I was using something like sumac. Once in a while, I'll use something from well out of our range, like occasionally I'll use logwood for a nice purple, or Brazil wood is another one. Although Brazil wood can go right to a stronger red. If I used it without soaking it, so I didn't get as much dye, then I could also get a pink, but
Mhm.
usually it gives me a bright red. So,
Okay, thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you.
yeah, thank you. Oh, I think avocado seeds will give you a nice color like that as well. I haven't done that because I have to eat more of them, I think, to get enough dye material.
So another question about teas, the spikenard berries.
Sure.
Someone's curious about what you think of their flavor, and to them, it reminds them a little bit like Coca-Cola, but perhaps it's because of the color that might be putting it in their head.
No, that's a good comparison because the tonics that our sodas came from are based on herbal teas, herbal extractions that Indigenous people, and I would imagine folks from other parts of the globe, have other materials that they use to make similar drinks. Certain times of year, they're thought of as very healthful to have. And so wild sarsaparilla, spikenard roots are used. The berries have, to me, a really delicate flavor. I haven't tried cooking them down or anything. For me, they seem a little bit more delicate, but the root tea is a little bit more heading towards root beer. Sassafras, another one. If you're a root tea person, sassafras is pretty common in the Northeast. It grows all over the place. And there's a ton of it on Martha's Vineyard. So that's a real common one to gather some of the roots. You don't have to kill the tree, to gather some roots, or you can just take, if there's a lot of little saplings, you can just take those little tiny saplings, gather the roots, clean them really well. You might want to dry them, put them by for later use. And then you just put them in a pot with some water and you simmer and simmer and simmer them till it gets as strong as you want it, basically. And then with a little honey or maple syrup or sugar, depending on what kind of sweetener you like, they're really good.
I have one more question.
Mhm.
Hi, when you say spikenard, you're talking about an Aurelia, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Spikenard staff of man. I'm trying to remember. Common names are also tricky sometimes.
Devil and the something. Devil. The spectrum.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
sort of it gets to be bushy, so it's much bigger than like wild sarsaparilla in the
Right.
Northeast.
Right. Yeah.
But it's a related plant. Yeah, so yep, you're on the right track.
Another question that came in is, let me see, I just lost it. Oh, I think I lost it.
Okay.
Oh, one question is, what do you use for mordant with your dyes?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So some things don't require mordant. So black walnut has tannic acid in it. The husk has tannic acid in it. So you don't need to add anything. It'll just stick to the yarn and be permanent. And then the longer you let it simmer in the dye and soak in the dye, the darker your brown will be, anywhere from a light tan to a deep brown. With sumac berries, same thing. They've got a lot of tannic acid, so you don't have to add anything. If you need a mordant for a different dye, like let's say Osage orange or some of the other dyes I use, you can gather sumac leaves, simmer them, get a mordant solution, put your yarn in that, maybe simmer it for anywhere from like a half an hour to 45 minutes, low temperature. You don't want to have a rolling boil for your mordants, because you don't want to, you can ruin the texture of your yarn if you, boil it at a high temperature. In materials like that, tannic acid, oak galls are another one really high in tannic acid in the Northeast. So oak galls both create a nice tan dye, but also it's kind of light. So basically using as a mordant with a fairly strong color dye, you're not going to influence the color too much. And so that's another ideal. And then of course you can go and buy commercial mordants too, if you want to use those. I would just tend, if you're going to buy a commercial mordant, those tend to be metal salts, exhaust the dye. You take up the mordant in your yarn or whatever, so you're not dumping them and wasting them and dumping them into the environment. They're not terrible, but I just think it's better if you can use them up and not waste them.
Laura Parsons has a question.
Okay.
My dog is barking. I was wondering about your background and where you learned a lot of this plant uses. And
yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a fair question. So my academic background is in marine biology, and I've taken, years ago, I took wetland resources courses as well. And also some of my teachers in the Native community, my family members, worked with plants, because plants, as you could probably guess from my presentation, are the basis for a lot of our traditional arts. Pretty much everything. So rushes and grasses and barks, and then things from animals and so on and so forth. So I learned basketry and finger weaving from my cousin Head-Aquinnah, who passed away decades ago. I was very lucky, I think, to have some older generation folks still around who had been making baskets before they stopped being particularly useful, before plastics just took over the world. And so, generations ago, a couple of generations ago, folks could actually support their families on their basketry skills, on broom making, on barrel making, on, herbal remedies for different ailments and tonics, like root beer, traditional root beer and things like that. That plant knowledge is really important. And it was a strong underpinning of the way that I was taught. And also just being outside, it's healthy, it's important, it's interesting. You get a lot of other benefits. You can learn more about the health of the environment and figure out what you can do. So I was also taught to have a very reciprocal relationship with nature. So to plant, if you're going to pick something or harvest something, make sure you're planting more where you can, or spreading the patches out. So there's other backup areas that wildlife and humans can use. So it's kind of a more sustainable way to relate to New England plants. When I got older and I became really inquisitive and wanted to try everything and use everything for arts, and I really started to get super organized and compile lists and do archival research into plants that were described some generations back or even hundreds of years ago sometimes, that used to be really common or even traded far out of the region, or unfortunately over harvested when the pharmaceutical industry kind of got a hold of native knowledge. And the pharmaceutical industry really got going with mass-produced bottles and mass-produced medicines. That was out of native hands, and it wasn't being done in a sustainable fashion. And some things were very much these fad cures, like the plant hepatica, which I think is really interesting looking. It's really rare in Massachusetts because of that overharvest. Lady slipper was another one that was badly overharvested. So where in tribal communities, you sort of have this tradition of keeping, wild places, keeping forests, keeping wetlands intact, helping the health of those, counting plants and only taking a certain amount, or if it's a bad year, you just don't gather it. Once those practices got overshadowed by extreme commercialism and folks coming here that didn't necessarily know much about the environment, but just grabbed the plants that were worth something on the market or whatever, things got rare. And it's still happening. There's unsustainable use of cohosh. There's unsustainable use of slippery elm. Suddenly slippery elm's a rare tree. That's really sad. Those are beautiful trees. They're really important. And, there's diseases that are affecting the more time you spend out and looking and reading. Dog beans are affected by, there's a pathogen affecting them. There's issues with elm. Obviously Dutch elm disease has been around forever. I think beeches, hemlocks now have some issues. It's kind of a little rugged between humans and pollution and some of the things that are introduced. It's kind of rugged on the population. So I love plants, and I spent a lot of time ranging all over the place looking for things, and then realizing, okay, they're not in this area anymore at all, and then sometimes you can find seeds from someplace else and you can start growing them on your property. So I always hope that those are modest ways that you can help the environment. I've also encouraged students in the colleges that I've worked at to look into native plants and grow. And some of them have been pretty ambitious. It's been impressive, actually, to see the projects that they've done. And also, if you grow it, you get to benefit from having some fruit, or trying the tea, or just tasting a leaf for fun. It's enriching, and I think an important part of living in New England.
What would be your top 3 must-have plants to add to your yard? If you're going to add 3 more plants to your yard this spring, what 3 would you recommend?
That's such a tough question. Wow.
And why?
Oh my gosh. I think, that's a little bit tricky because everybody's soil is not created equally. I think sedges are gorgeous. If you're going to grow grass, you might as well grow something indigenous and let it seed and let it really benefit the birds. So I found that, in my backyard, if I don't cut the grass, the birds come and basically sound like they have a party every day, all day. And if I mowed, all of that wonderful singing stopped. And so it was a really good way to communicate to me the value of having producing grasses that had richness and food and harbored insects. Joe Pyeweed is an interesting pollinator. It's an indigenous plant. It likes moisture. It's named after a native person, so it's got an interesting story to it that you can read about. I see Russ Cohen is here. I've actually gotten some plants from you. Hi. And some really good hickory nuts. Thank you. I still remember that. So yeah, Joe Pyeweed has a lot of value in terms of the environment. It's also not difficult to grow at all, which is awesome. I love sweet fern. It's valuable. It's fragrant. It keeps bugs away if you rub it on your skin. I just love the way it looks. And outside of that, I think it's just sort of such a wide world of indigenous plants and berries and things. It's kind of up to you and your space, how much sunlight you get and what you want to grow. I think anything is great, personally. I know that's not very selective, but go ahead. You have
Well,
a...
thank you.
Yep.
And, I just want to say I have all three of those already, so thank you.
Oh, that's awesome. Good. Good
And
for you.
Russ had his hand up. But you're still on mute, Russ.
Okay, how's that?
There you go.
Yes, I can
So
hear you.
hi, David. Hi, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Nice to see you.
So that's fascinating about Skin So Soft having sweet fern in it. I did not know that. I'm going to look into that. That's really cool to know. Because of course it's sort of like an off-label thing anyway, that people would use it as an insect repellent. I was always wondering, now why would a product like that have that capacity?
Yeah.
What I tell people is if like it's during, you know, one of those really hot, humid summers when the deer flies are out and they're like starting to dive bomb you and they're driving you kind of crazy. If you can just find some sweet fern and just grab a handful of it and just rub it all over your skin. It's not deep, but I do find that it reduces the severity of the attack enough to bother, you know, going to the trouble of applying it to your skin.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's, well, deep, you want to be careful of.
Right.
Obviously. Yeah.
So have you had any experience using high bush cranberry?
Yeah, it's actually I tried growing high bush cranberry here because I have believe it or not, Norway maples on my property, and they're kind of overshadow things, and it's really hard to grow stuff underneath them because they take a lot of nutrients and water out of the soil. So high bush cranberry is actually one of the ones that will grow underneath it. That and it's not native, but it's beautiful. Sweet woodruff also will grow under a Norway maple. And I've had things made of it. I didn't make anything myself because I usually, you know, a lot of times I have blueberry bushes here, the spikenard, the wild cherries. Yeah, the birds really beat everybody out. And so I think I'd have to get careful and kind of net things and all to get more of a harvest here, I think.
So the reason I ask about that one is for those of you that don't know high bush cranberry, it's a viburnum, so it's not related to the bog cranberry at all. So it's a shrub. And when you see it in the wild, unfortunately, in southern New England, what you often run into is this non-native, very close lookalike called Gelderrose. It's actually from Sweden. And the problem with that one is that the fruit tastes horrible no matter how much sugar you add. You can never make it taste good. Whereas the high bush cranberry, if you have the native one, the Viburnum trilobum, you can make a sauce from it that really does taste amazingly like the bog cranberry sauce. And it's even, if possible, an even brighter pinkish red color. So I mention that because years ago, I don't know if you know Julian De Silva, who was working for the Mashpee Wampanoags for a while as an AmeriCorps volunteer.
Yes, sure. I met him.
And he invited me down to walk the Mashpee Wampanoag land and to see what plants were there, edible medicinal plants were there. And so I did that. And then one of the sites, Moshop Farm in Mashpee, I said, you know, there's some stuff here, but there's tremendous potential for adding additional things there. So I brought a whole bunch of plants down from my nursery and Julie and I planted them. Nice. So one of the species was Jerusalem artichoke, because there was this discreet little spot where we could plant it. And when it spreads, not if it spreads, but when it spreads, I thought it would stay out of trouble where we put it and not mess up anything else. So I have not been back in several years to see these plants, but I did run into Julian last summer and he said they're doing really well. So one of the sites we went to is the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Museum,
Yes.
which had a high bush cranberry bush growing right outside of the museum. And when I was there with Julian, it was late November and the shrub was covered with ripe fruit. And so Julian picked some, I picked some, and I was able to propagate at least 24 high bush cranberry plants from those seeds. So if you'd like
Very
some
nice.
of those plants that I grew from seeds from the tribal museum, all right, I'll figure out how to get those to you.
Awesome. That sounds lovely.
Yeah,
Thank you.
they're already at least 2 feet tall.
Yeah, I've had a sort of a mild jelly or jam made from them. To me, it's not quite as strong as cranberry, but it's a
Right.
really nice glaze on meat.
Mm,
As well, if you put it on chicken or something like that, it's quite good. So,
right. Well, I don't want to monopolize your time. I'll ask one more brief thing. Have you ever had jam made from the tupelo berries, the Nyssa sylvatica, the black gum?
I have,
Yeah,
no.
so it's a native species, of course, quite common in the Cape and the Islands,
Oh, yeah.
and has the blue fruit that's ripe in the fall. And sometimes you can find quite a lot of it, where you find one tree that's just covered with hundreds of the fruit. Now, of course, these trees can be quite tall and it's hard to reach way up and get the ones in the upper branches, but so you take your human share that you can reach from the lower branches, and then the ones in the upper branches are the wildlife share. And that works out okay. So I've propagated a lot of tupelo plants from those seeds inside those berries, and I've nibbled on the berries. And it's a very intensely sour flavor, as you probably know. But
I can imagine.
I'd never made anything from the berries. And then I went to a New England Botanical Club meeting, which is a potluck in January, and somebody had brought some Nyssa sylvatica jam, and it was really good. And it was purple, which I guess is because of the blue color of the outside of the berries, because as you know, the inside color, so the pulp surrounding the berries is green.
Yeah.
So I guess when you prepare the jam, the color from the skin of the berries comes off and colors the whole thing purple, but it was really good.
Oh,
So I look
sounds
forward
good.
to trying that sometime, next season, next fall, when I do run into a lot of the
Tupelo. Yeah.
tupelo berries.
Yeah, that sounds you could get a ton on the Cape.
Yeah,
For sure.
that's interesting, Russ, because we have so many here at Pinewoods Camp.
Mhm.
And so we'll have to maybe harvest some and give it a try.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Sure.
One other question was, does sweetgrass grow on the Cape or islands?
Yeah. And I found some here, even I live in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. I found some here even as a kid, just because I was a kid who got into everything in the woods, picked stuff and braided stuff or made stuff, you find some that have that nice vanilla scent. Some of the stuff that grows is shorter species, so it's not necessarily as tall as sort of classic sweetgrass that folks use for a lot of the basketry and braids. So there's different varieties, and different ones like different habitats, slightly different habitats, I'm going to say. I've smelt it on the island, but there's this, so like the Cape and Islands, they're kind of tricky because there's like a lot of private property and people who really get up in arms should you accidentally on purpose trespass. And so, there's times when I can tell something's around or I can see something blooming, but, don't really want the hassle of yelling people, angry people on Cuttyhunk or whatever, coming out of their buildings and, crabbing and threatening, whatever. And so, yeah, it's definitely around. I think, it's possible that certain things have changed distribution, like maybe overgrazing or over fertilizing certain areas that don't favor native plants have made some of those things less rare, less common, excuse me. I think they thrive on natural rich soils and natural high levels of moisture, but I'm not so sure about the chemicals that a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of places, folks like ChemLawn and things like that. And that's not so healthy, let's just say.
So if I'm the one that asked that question, and thank you for answering it. I have a hard time, I'm walking around sometimes, especially in the summer, wet meadow, and I say, sweetgrass, that's sweetgrass. But I just have the darndest time actually knowing for sure that grass that I'm sniffing and smelling is in fact sweetgrass.
Yeah.
Because I'm just not very good distinguishing different types of grasses apart. But I do
Grasses are their
catch
own thing.
the
Yeah.
aroma from it.
Yeah, you're not imagining things. It's definitely around. It's, working with grass a lot, you'll get a much better eye for it. I was growing some sweetgrass, and the farmer who ran the greenhouse that I was using didn't touch my grasses, and she saw me weeding the sweetgrass, and she said, "I'm so glad you're weeding that, Elizabeth, because I cannot distinguish between what you're pulling out and what you're trying to grow." And they were close, but they weren't identical. You can look at the little characteristics, like how much red, or is it hairy, does it have micro hairs on it, versus whether it's quite smooth. Sweetgrass, when it gets bigger, you sort of see this lovely shine and this kind of lighter green quality to it. It's quite pretty. And then of course the scent is the giveaway, right? And then you can look at seeds, and you can look at roots, and if you want to get really into it, you can get the little the little magnifying glass, so you can look at the seeds really closely. And
all right, yeah,
yeah,
I haven't done that.
The plant nerd thing. So it's really fun. It's good with kids because they're just amazed by how much you can learn from a plant.
So speaking of sweet smelling plants, do you have any experience working with sweet flag?
Let's see. So there's two, they're related. One is good to use and one is sketch. You wouldn't want to ingest it. And I'll smell it in freshwater ways with bulrush and stuff like that. I have not harvested it because I don't commonly see tons of it. The places that I've been, maybe because of pollution. So that's another thing that makes me leery. I won't just harvest things anywhere. There's one that a lot of native singers like to use because the juice is really good and soothing for your throat.
Right.
It's good for you if you have a cold and all too, but the other one is kind of bad news.
Right. So I think what you're referring to is there's a native North American one, which is Acorus americanus, and then there's the European one, which is Acorus calamus, which was brought over by the settlers.
Yeah.
And I just learned how to tell them apart. There is a way to tell them apart, and it's the veining in the leaves that I think that the one of them has 3 veins in the leaves and the other one has just 1 vein. And I think it's a native one that has 3 veins in the leaves.
Yeah, I had a Passamaquoddy elder who always supplied my bitterroot. So I just would go and trade with him and he lived out of the way, so I wasn't worried about pollution and stuff. So that was my way of accessing it.
Yes. So as you know, many of our native species, if you look at a range map and we say, well, it occurs naturally here and there. Well, of course, Native Americans moved many of these plants around. And so when, we set up this arbitrary, clock ticking of 1620, whenever it is, and said, anything was there before 1620, it's native, it's native, it's native. Well, sure, but it may be in that place because it was deliberately brought there by Native Americans. And I understand that sweet flag was one of those species that was commonly traded amongst tribes and, planted lots of places beyond its native range. Absolutely.
Yeah, you can hear out to the Great Lakes, probably beyond, but I'm probably most familiar with like Great Lakes, Algonquian family tribes and some of the Dakota tribes using it as well. Definitely. Yeah. I mean, you look at the distributions, there were a few things happening. Folks were obviously trading plant knowledge and sharing seeds and how to grow things. And as climates and things changed as well, you could grow things in new areas. That definitely happened. Things traveling along our trade routes. And there's also land management practices like controlled burning to preserve pine barren habitats and things like that favored certain plants staying in an area even when they eventually would have been crowded out without any kind of intervention as well too. So that's kind of interesting. prickly pear is an interesting, I'm sure the animals have a lot to do with the distribution of prickly pear plants. And I found a ton of them growing on Long Island. I was really thrilled
Yeah, I've
about
seen them
that.
there too.
Yeah, it's nice to see. They used to be a lot more common on Martha's Vineyard, but I'm not sure what happened. On the Cape and Islands too, there's a military base. There were operations, target practice on some of the smaller islands and stuff like that. I sort of wonder about pollution and things like that in certain areas, or, also habitat degradation and just overdevelopment of places.
Well, also, we have to acknowledge that when you're talking about a species like eastern prickly pear that will grow like on a barrier beach, you're talking about a lot of natural disturbance too, storms and stuff that can just, cause tremendous reshaping of the coastal landforms that can eliminate habitat, even if, of course, we're aggravating it with climate change, but, a natural storm could, take out a patch of eastern prickly pear,
Totally.
without
Yeah.
any pollution
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah, that's true.
Awesome. So there was another question. Oh, one of the questions is, where could you where's a good source for native plants? And I know, Elizabeth, you grow some native plants, and
Yeah.
Russ grow some native plants. And also here in Eastern Mass in Norwell is a native only plant nursery called Blue Stem Natives, which was actually started by 3 members of Wild Ones, the South Shore Mass chapter. They were all on the board, lamenting that you can't get any native plants, so it's very hard to find them in local nurseries. And so they ventured out and actually started that, and their website is actually a great resource as well. So yes.
Yeah, I probably, in tribal communities, I'll usually find the plant geeks, and we trade knowledge. And my first Jerusalem artichokes I got from Emma Jo's, one of the Mills family properties. She just dug some up and gave them to me. Ground nuts, from another person. I've collected over the years from various folks and traded seeds as well. I think if you like the social interaction, sometimes that's nice. And sometimes it's nice to know the person who's growing your plants, if that makes sense. See how they relate to them, and, get insights into how to use them and coax good materials out of them as well that way too. So yeah, I think native plants are becoming a little bit more appreciated in the Northeast as people think about the health of the habitat, and our health, and pollinators and insects and things like that too. So you can get seeds online sometimes. It's just when you're sourcing seeds, you want them to be harvested in a sustainable fashion. You don't want to be like the ginseng hunters. They scare the daylights out of me. I'm just harvesting everything everywhere sometimes. That's just kind of troubling, and I wouldn't really want to get into that. But if you can see if the seeds are non-genetically modified, that's really important. Are they sustainable and ethically harvested? That's really important too. And you can look around your environment and see what's supposed to be there, and try to find plants or seeds that you can start putting those back, and let the birds and the wildlife help you to help your sad little suburban neighborhood be a lot more useful and beautiful. So
Excellent.
So can I just add something about Jerusalem artichoke that you mentioned? So going back to the plants being traded by tribal groups. So some of the earliest European explorers to the New World, like the Samuel de Champlain and people like that, as they're sailing in their ships up the St. Lawrence River, they're seeing tended patches of Jerusalem artichokes all over the place. This is, in the 1500s. So it was very well established there. But if you go to the official repository of information for what's considered to be a native plant, which is Go Botany, maintained by the Native Plant Trust, they call Jerusalem artichoke a non-native plant. And so,
Oh.
so this is where we get into the, the
Oh, the
fact is Jerusalem
semantics.
artichoke was all over this area. And
I find it
but-
at old village sites. I mean, that's
oh,
one of the-
absolutely. So
Yeah.
they, so of course the answer is that both are true. So if you go back in botanical history, you'll see that the original homeland of Jerusalem artichoke was the Plain States. It was the upper Midwest.
Yeah.
But yes,
Sure.
it was in the Northeast all over the place many, many hundreds of years ago. How did it get here? It's because our tribes traded for it. Because we had
absolutely.
quahog shells or other things that appealed to the Midwestern tribes, and we got Jerusalem artichoke tubers in return. And you're absolutely right that some of the places where I see patches of Jerusalem artichokes growing wild are places where Native Americans originally established the plants growing in those spots.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You can find, I mean, there's been times when you can find the ovens that were used to cook them too, if you're lucky. So that's always really, that context is quite interesting. Or Indian wells, you'll see those in New England sometimes. They're kind of flush to the ground and they're kind of different from European wells. Yeah, there's all kinds of little treasures, I think, in the Northeast when you know where to look. And those trade routes were big. There's so much knowledge that went back and forth. So many shared traditions. And yeah, the other thing to look out for when you're doing research is sometimes those common names are real misleading. Because I was chatting with somebody and we were talking about, maybe it was bearberry, and it's applied to more than one plant. So it can get tricky when you're trying to talk about bearberry or using another common name. And folks are kind of like, you did what with it? Yep, yeah, it's a different plant, so sometimes that comes out too.
The trouble with common names.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure, yeah.
And one person has a common name for this plant and someone else has a common name, the same common name for the same plant. It can get very confusing.
For sure.
Do we have any more questions before we sign off for the evening? So just a reminder that we will be posting this on the Pinewoods Camp YouTube channel. And so be looking out for this in a couple of weeks. Again, we want to just say thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your knowledge. That was fascinating. And Wild One South Shore chapter, thank you for partnering with Pinewoods Camp on this. And also we want to give another shout out to the Mass Cultural Council and the local cultural councils of Plymouth and Scituate for helping fund the program. So thank you all, and we will see you soon. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.